Come on in, have a seat. Good evening, I'm Matt Grossman. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research here at MSU, and I'm pleased to welcome you to examine the first 100 days of the Donald Trump administration. Thank you for coming. We apologize for the traffic redirection that some of you experienced. We're pleased to present this program alongside the LeFrak Forum and Symposium on Science, Reason, and Modern Democracy, as well as the Department of Political Science. Tonight's program also reflects our history. MSU hosted a similar review in 1993 of the Bill Clinton administration that brought together 6 faculty members and featured 2 journalists who had served as the questioners at the 1992 presidential debate here on campus. At that time, of course, it was Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ross Perot. And Bill Clinton's first 100 days were also tumultuous, and MSU's discussion of them was vibrant and prophetic. The panelists discussed whether one high-profile legislative failure, at that time it was the stimulus package, and constant media distractions were a bad omen for the administration's future. They also said Clinton's lack of international experience had shown, and they questioned whether he could live up to his promises to return power to the people. At that time, tonight's speakers were already watching closely. Ron Fournier had been covering Clinton at the Arkansas State House and was called to Washington for the Associated Press, and he's reported on every president since then. Back then, Bill Kristol helped to lead conservative opposition to the Clinton health plan, and he's also been active in critiquing every administration since. I believe at least one of the faculty members from our Clinton 100 Days event are with us tonight. Is Joe Darden here? And perhaps Mordecai Crain? Okay, well thank you both, and I also want to thank Cindy Kyle for preparing this event, and our co-sponsors who are here with us this evening. Arthur Meltzer, the founder of the LeFrak Forum, Steve Kautz, who's the College of Social Science Associate Dean, and Chuck Ostrom, who's the chairman of MSU's Department of Political Science. I believe we also have Ann Mervin with us, who's the co-director of the Michigan Political Leadership Program. We're accepting applications already for those of you who want to step into the ring themselves and be more involved in politics. Our moderator for the discussion tonight is Zoe Clark. She is Michigan Radio's program director, overseeing all its programming and the station's award-winning newsroom, commentary, and daily news magazine stateside. She also hosts It's Just Politics, co-hosts a weekly look at Michigan politics, and she holds degrees in communication studies and political science from our neighbors in Ann Arbor. Please join me in welcoming Zoe Clark.
Great. I am hoping that we're going to have a very lively discussion this evening. No offense to the 1993 version.
Woo, boy. There were 6 professors, 2 of which were here, and it was amazing to watch. We have Bill Ballinger in the audience, I believe. Bill, you asked a question, in fact, many years ago, so I hope you're going to do the same tonight. It has been 100 days or 102 because facts do matter. I don't want to get into any alternative facts. So 102 days, 2,400 hours. That is 144,000 minutes. And on his 100th day, the president had tweeted 516 times since taking office. I am a numbers fan, so let's keep going, shall we? He played golf, at least as we know it, 19 times. Compare that with President Obama, how many times do you think he had played in 100 days? 0 times on the links. 25 days away from the White House. Compare that with Obama's 4. Now, numbers of bills signed, Trump 28, Obama 11. Executive orders, Trump 30, Obama 29. Obama had visited 9 countries by now. Trump, 0. But who's really counting? If you voted for Donald Trump or not, I think it's fair to say, as Matt said, the 100 days have been full of tumult. For some, excitement, right? Waking up every single morning exciting for what's to come under the new president. For others, it is dread. But our two guests this evening, my guess is I don't think they wake up with excitement or dread because these men are big thinkers. They are idea men, and that is what we are here to talk with them tonight about what all of this means, both in the past and also going forward. So please, please welcome me in welcoming Bill Kristol and Ron Fournier.
You're on the left?
Okay, you go.
Okay,
Okay,
but-
yeah, I'm going on the right. Okay.
Physically, not ideologically.
And I need my cheat sheet.
Right, and you need your notes. So Matt Grossman briefly introduced both of your backgrounds, and I don't want to do too much bios because the truth is if I did bios on both of you, we would be here for the next 90 minutes just talking about all of your achievements and accomplishments because you
Go ahead.
two, keep going, don't stop.
It would be boring.
I want to quickly introduce Bill Kristol, the founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, a conservative commentator who, and I loved this, Bill, Politico wrote last summer, is, quote, the rare Republican still fighting to defend his party's principles from a rogue nominee. You have also been called
That worked out.
yeah, how'd that work out for you? Well, and the sitting president, I believe, called you
I don't know what.
a loser? Right, but you have been tweeted at by the sitting president, so you've got that going for you. Ron Fournier, Ron, you have been a columnist at The Atlantic and was editor-in-chief at the National Review. So again, I said idea men here. National Journal, sorry. You were the Washington bureau chief at the Associated Press for many, many years, but last year you decided to come home.
Yeah.
Home to Detroit. You are now the editor and publisher of Crain's Detroit Business, and we are really lucky to have you back in Michigan.
I'm lucky to be back.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. So, a message to all of you now. We want to hear from you this evening. The three of us could talk shop all night long, just, again, talking about their bios, but we want to hear from you. Some of you have already submitted questions in advance, so I'm going to ask some of those, and they're amazing questions. I'm super excited to ask some of them. But there are also two ways for you to interact with us. One is you got cards, so please fill those out throughout the evening, especially if there's something that piques your interest, you want to follow up, you want to hear a little bit more. Or don't be shy. Come up to these two mics when we say it's audience participation time. Because again, we want to hear from you. There are some really, really smart, thoughtful people in this audience, and we would love to hear your questions. So let's get started. I was asked to start off with one large, all-encompassing question, and I sort of spent all weekend thinking about what that would be, and I think I came up with, can you name 9 bands that you've seen in person and one that you haven't seen live? Totally kidding. But Bill, you were thinking about it. You were ready to do it, right?
I was in panic. Did I call my kids on my cell phone?
You start tweeting them. But seriously, I think what I really want to get to quickly, and I think this is what most of us are thinking, is just have we ever seen anything like this before? And what does that mean for the future? And Ron, I see you shaking your head. Help me put this into context. Where are we at right now in American political history?
Holy moly.
And
Well-
in 30 seconds.
Well, you know, as you know and Bill knows, politics doesn't drive society. Society drives politics. So we're at a time of once-in-a-century economic change, not just a recession, but a completely change in revolution in the way we live and work, on top of a technological revolution unlike anything we've seen in 100 years, on top of a demographic revolution unlike anything we've seen in 100 years. And when you put those three things together, you get our version of the Gilded Age, a time when our institutions aren't adapting as quickly as we're being forced to change. That gets us angry. That leads us to not trust our institutions. So we have a crisis of trust in this country. We don't trust, generally speaking, the presidency, Congress, the media, our churches, our priests, our pastors, our heads of our charities, our small businesses, our school businesses, our big businesses, Wall Street, schools. We don't trust any of our institutions. And as you know, our institutions are the only thing that separates society from anarchy. So when we're that tore up, when we're that at odds, when we're that disconnected from our institutions and that angry and frustrated and scared and buffeted by change, we get mad, especially at our politics. And if you look at all the institutions, some of them have changed quite a bit. Our entertainment industry, our retail industry, the media. But politics hasn't changed at all the last 20 years. So that's why we're in this midst of this populist revolt. Donald Trump was only half of that this last election. Bernie Sanders was the other, and it spreads across the spectrum. And I know Bill probably did the same thing I did. Countless times I would go to a Bernie Sanders rally in the morning and a Donald Trump rally in the afternoon, and I'd see a lot of the same types of people. They didn't look alike. They weren't the same age. They hated each other, but they all wanted to take down corporate welfare, push back on the invasions of our privacy by big businesses and government. They wanted to take on big banks, throw bankers in jail. They wanted disruption in politics. And one way or another, we got it.
Yeah. Bill, a change in the status quo.
Yeah, I let Ron go to the Trump and Sanders rallies, so I didn't have to. But, I appreciate that. Really. I read his reports very dutifully. No, I very much agree about the social, economic, and cultural changes, which are big underlying changes in society. But then also, just get to the more, nuts and bolts political moment. We have a president who is unlike every previous president, just in a very simple way. He has held neither elective office nor cabinet office nor been a general officer in the U.S. Army. And every previous president had held one of those, at least one of those public offices. So there was a little more predictability about how the president might, if the president has been a vice president or a cabinet secretary or a senator or a governor, maybe you could even say a general in the Army, in the military, I guess they were all Army generals who became president. There's some predictability about how that person will behave in public office. We just don't know with Trump. I mean, he's the outsider who finally won. We have plenty of outsiders who run for president who fell short. Usually on the Republican side, they would run and not make it in the primaries. And after a stretch, incidentally, where the political system actually was producing very conventional candidates. And I don't say that critically, because I admire a lot of them. But really, if you think of the last, I'd say since 1980, certainly since 88 or 92, we've had sitting governors, senators, vice presidents as nominees. We've had the Doles and the Romneys and the Clintons and the Gores and the John Kerrys and the John McCains. And it was pretty much often the person who one thought a year ahead of time might be the nominee, usually was the nominee. Barack Obama upset Hillary Clinton in 08, but even then he had the support of people like Ted Kennedy and lots of major Democrats. So Trump winning both the nomination at first and then the presidency is just very unusual empirically. I mean, so we're right, if people feel like, gee, we haven't really seen this before, they're right to have that sense. We really haven't seen it before. And then he's also unusual in the sense that he also ran against his own party. He ran against the establishment of both parties. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time since, but parties have nominated occasionally people who ran against their own party's recent traditions or against the establishments of their own parties, Goldwater in 64, McGovern in 72, but usually they lose the general election. Having a president who ran against his own party and, of course, ran against the other party as well, again, means you're sort of in uncharted waters. I mean, he's not a conventional Republican. He doesn't seem to want to be a conventional, let's call it, bipartisan type. He's certainly not a Democrat. He's not even obviously from one of the main strands in the Republican Party, social conservative or libertarian or hawk or whatever. He's actually attacked all of them. So people are right to say, well, this is really a moment that's very hard to know what's going to happen, very hard to draw lessons, I think, from the past. People like Ron and me and political scientists and historians tend to say, well, this is analogous to 1993, Clinton's first 100 days, or the Reagan maybe if you like Trump, or Carter if you don't like Trump, or whatever, but if you want a failed first term president. But it's really just hard to know, I think, analytically where it goes. And final point I would make, just to pick up on the Sanders point, which I think has been everyone is so obsessed with Trump, understandably, that people have sort of forgotten about the Sanders phenomenon. That is amazing, that Bernie Sanders, who refused to be a Democrat because he thought the party was too moderate and establishment, who called himself a socialist, and still does, got 45% of the vote in the Democratic primary. And Trump got 45% of the vote in the Republican primary. So think about this. You're not in a recession, not in a depression. It's not 1935, when, of course, you understand why people are attracted to Huey Long or maybe Father Coughlin or something. Whatever the problems with the economy, whatever the problems, I'm aware of them with middle class and working class stagnation, elites out of touch and all that. At the end of the day, America in 2016, I don't think you would look at it and say, whoa, this is just a horrible place that's suffering like it's never suffered before. We're not in the middle of a Vietnam type war. It's not LBJ in 68. We're not in the middle, obviously, of World War II type war. And yet, 45% of the voters in each party voted for a candidate who I'd say everyone would have agreed a year or two before was way out of the mainstream of either party. And I'm not saying that critically, maybe it was good to be out of the mainstream, but we're not the conventional candidates of either party. And therefore, I agree with Ron, the depth, or at least the breadth of popular discontent is something that one really has to be struck by in 2016. So you add that to the fact that Trump is an unusual president, and the public is very volatile and not predictable in the way maybe it once was in terms of public opinion, and you really have an unusual moment.
Let me just add to that really
Please.
quickly. I'm going to push back on, you kind of gloss over Barack Obama, and he was conventional. Donald Trump is Barack Obama 2.0, and every Democrat in this room is going to come charging at me. But Barack Obama, because of the climate I talked about, he rose out of that. Now, I think a lot of people would say he was a more affirmational change agent. But the public's been demanding change for the last several cycles. And the fact that an African-American named Barack Hussein Obama, who had only served about 3 minutes in the Senate, and had never run a business, and never been a chief executive, could win the election is part of this public's demand for change. Now, he's a much different cat personally, and a much different leader. I'm not comparing him as a person to Donald Trump. But what we saw with Sanders and Trump wasn't just this year. I mean, this actually has a connection back to Pat Buchanan. This has been building a long time, and Trump is just, we don't even know if Trump is the crest of the wave, or if it's even going to get bigger. And think about the fact, I live a mile away from Macomb County, Michigan. There are thousands of people who voted for Barack Obama twice in Macomb County, Michigan, and then voted for Trump. Donald Trump carried Macomb County twice. Trump won it this time.
Obama carried it twice. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I say Trump?
yeah.
Yeah, Obama carried it twice and the Trump
Yeah.
won. There's something going on out there that's
No, I think
bigger than we
that's
realize.
and I take the point about Obama, and you can write the narrative back to Perot and Buchanan, obviously in '92, and other things, and it's fair enough, though it's also the case that one could have had a situation where there are these failed, you might say, populist revolts and spasms, and they go away, they get assimilated by the party. Perot seemed to get assimilated by Gingrich and the Republican Revolution.
True.
Obama seemed to be a successful assimilation of a younger generation, obviously African Americans, into a Democratic Party that didn't want to just nominate another Clinton. The Tea Party seemed to be successfully assimilated, I would say, on the Republican side. They ran in a bunch of primaries, some of them won, some of them lost, but you ended up with a Ted Cruz and a Marco Rubio and other people who would challenge the establishment in the Senate. And I do think in that respect, I guess I would say Obama beating Clinton is a little bit like, I don't know, one of the underdog, like a Rubio or something emerging as the Republican nominee, a different type of nominee than is traditional in the party, a little bit more of an outsider, or maybe Cruz if you want to be a little further, more ideological. I do think Trump is a little sui generis in just the kind of the degree of outsiderness that he embodies.
I agree.
And yet what I want to jump into is this idea that he was so full of change, and I think that was exactly
Full
as
of
you
what?
said. Change.
Oh, change, okay.
Change. Woo!
Because I agree either way.
And yet we're already seeing these sort of 180-degree turnarounds, right? Whether it's on China and currency manipulation, whether it's on NAFTA. So are we kind of seeing this playbook, seen this movie before that we're promised, or voters are promised change? Then you get into the system, you get into the swamp, and suddenly it's not so easy to train.
Well, or conversely, you realize that there's a real world out there, and there are reasons that some of these policies and institutions are in place, and it's not so easy to, and it's not a good idea to change them. I'm sort of happy about the 180 degree, I mean, they're not really 180 degree, but let's say 60 and 90 and 120 degree reversals. And I think, I'd say two things about them. I mean, maybe he's learning that some of these things, NATO is maybe not super efficient, and the Europeans don't pay their share, and there are some old-fashioned things about it. But on the whole, given the alternative of, let's say, cavalierly breaking up NATO and trying to strengthen it as it is, it's probably safer to strengthen it as it is. And I would say Trump's made other calculations in certain aspects, especially of foreign policy. Same with trade, perhaps. It's nice to talk about rotten trade deals when you really look down and think about, do I really want to throw the whole relationship with Mexico and Canada up in the air? Maybe I'll just calm down a little on that. So some of that I regard as a good thing. I would say that, yes, the establishment has fought back, if you will, and the institutions are strong, which I also think is a good thing. I mean, they can be too strong in a way, too resistant to the public demands, too establishmentarian, too conservative with a little c, too set in their ways. On the other hand, it's basically a good thing, in my opinion, and it's what distinguishes the U.S. from a third world country in a way, that we have all these strong embedded institutions in the public and private sector that turn out not to be so easy to change just because one guy wins 46% of the popular vote and draws an inside straight in the Electoral College. And for me, that is a very good thing. The Congress, the judiciary, the state governments, the business sector, the universities, the not-for-profit sector. I mean, all these people think, you know what, I'm part of America, and because Trump has this view doesn't mean I have to have this view. And Trump is realizing that you can win the presidency, it's a heck of an achievement, but it doesn't mean that everyone else thinks.
And it's a lot harder, too, than you
right.
initially think
Well,
it
that's
is.
harder because he kind of has the vague view that it's like being head of the Trump organization, and you say, let's buy this property, and everyone says, oh, okay, sir, let's see if we can make that happen as soon as possible. Instead, it turns out Congress says, well, wait a second, I'm not sure we want to do this. The courts say, I'm not sure you have the right to do this. And a bunch of businesses say, well, wait a second, we have relationships here in Canada and Mexico, and we would prefer that you not do this, and we're pretty influential.
I'm a little bit more ambivalent.
Yeah.
I want my leaders, whether it's the head of my news organization or my pastor or my president, to be open-minded and be willing to change their mind. But what I look at as someone who tries to look at this objectively is how somebody changes their mind. Donald Trump changed his mind on China currency after having dinner with the Chinese president. Unless the Chinese president has some magic dust or pulled out some last-minute serious piece of information that changed his mind, I wonder how easily persuadable Donald Trump is. And is he one of these guys who believes the last person he talked to? If that's the case, that's a dangerous thing, the president. On NAFTA, what turned him on NAFTA was Sonny Perdue, his agriculture secretary, walking into the Oval Office with a map that showed him all the places where in rural America that depended on NAFTA, and said, these are all your voters. All your voters in rural America really depend on NAFTA. And Trump, on the record, has said, I have a lot of support out in those areas. I don't want to anger them. Well, again, it's one thing to be for or against NAFTA for principal reasons, and I can ride with anybody either way. But to change your mind because your cabinet secretary comes in with a map with the basic information that maybe he should have had already, kind of makes me wonder, is this a guy who's informed? Is this a guy who's intellectually curious? Is this a guy who's
The answer is
easily
no. I'm
persuadable?
just going to give you I'm going to give you a heads up on this here,
As you wax poetically.
Yeah.
I was like,
I just
no,
blew it right
no.
there. Can I just say hi to one of my favorite reporters, Kathy Barks Hoffman?
Oh,
Formerly of
right?
the Associated Press, now one of the great PR people in town. I used to come to, you would appreciate this, I would come to Michigan as the AP guy, and I would come and take her out for dinner or a drink and take all kinds of notes, and then I put my byline on top of it and send her to
Those were the good old days. This is the good old days of reporting that everyone's so nostalgic for.
Well, you know what? You did a nice bridge there because before I go to some listener questions, I do want to ask a question about the media and the media coverage of Trump because I think it is a dance unlike we've seen before. I mean, it's always a dance, but this is a very quick tango. And I thought it was so interesting when I was watching 24 years ago, the first 100 days that was here about Bill Clinton. And one of the people, and I wrote this down because I just thought, she said, living in a media age where things go by very quickly. And I just thought, oh, that is so darling, that 24 years ago, before we were sending emails, before, let alone tweets, I mean, this was before really emails, that things were going by very quickly. And I would love to hear from the two of you who have been covering D.C. and politics for a very long time. What has that been like in the Trump era? Can journalists keep up, Ron?
Hell yes.
Okay. But is there the infrastructure to keep up?
Well, there's not as many journalists. There's about half as many journalists as there were just 10 years ago. There's even a lower percentage of journalists in state houses, which we're talking earlier is a big problem. Yeah. Look, I'm an old wire guy. I came out of the Associated Press. Twitter is just AP. We were filing a news alert is as long as a tweet. I used to always push back on the fancy reporters for magazines or the New York Times who'd say, oh, you can't be fast and smart. Well, it turns out you can. But you do need an infrastructure. You do need to have reporters who have a little bit of gray hair. You do need to have enough people who covering the beats. The problem is we now have a couple things have happened. We've democratized the media. The internet has democratized the media. So now everybody is an editor and publisher. The media model has been collapsed. Therefore, like I said, we have fewer reporters. So now instead of us being the gatekeepers, which had its downsides, now all the information is flowing around us that we used to hold back, including the lies and the BS. And the fence that we used to put around a common set of facts is gone. And now those institutions that I was talking about have an enormous amount of power. They used to have to come to Kathy on bended knee and say, please write my story. And Kathy at the Associated Press decided, and her and a handful of other people in Lansing decided whether or not you're going to find out about it in the state of Michigan. She was a gatekeeper. Now, I just left a meeting at the Department of Transportation. Wonderful people. Their whole communication department was there. 12 or 13 really good people. They're all our former reporters, and they are all putting out more content every day than my newsroom is. So you now have this, you have, yes, we can do our jobs, but there's now more people who have more power and are more effectively at spinning us, at telling an alternative truth or a more favored truth to voters, and we have less influence and power and ability to be able to push back than we ever did.
Bill Kristol, can it be fixed?
No, well, no. I mean, look, there are pluses and minuses, obviously, to all these technological revolutions, and I think we're in the middle of one. I think we're actually rather early stages in terms of the ultimate effect of the combination of the personal computer or the mobile device now and the internet, on society and culture. And I do think that is a really big revolution. I am generally a skeptic of, and have been for decades, and I think I've usually been right about everything's changing faster than it ever did, blah, blah, blah. And I used to say that's just not true empirically. I mean, in many ways, our lives are more like our parents' and grandparents' lives than our grandparents were with their parents or grandparents, right? I mean, the pace of technological change in terms of transportation, health, other huge areas of life between, let's say, 1880 and 1950, I would say is much greater in those 70 years than between 1950 and 67 years and today. But I do think communications is now the place we have very, very quick and fundamental change. And it's just hard to know how it plays out. I'm a slight pushbacker against the excessive nostalgia for the good old days. The good old days when all these gatekeepers were gatekeeping and
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
No, you're with me. I think we're together on this. And everyone's being so responsible. Joe McCarthy got away with making up things for 2 or 3 years, and George Wallace was a very successful segregationist in the South, and people had all kinds of irresponsible views on all kinds of policies for years and got away with it, and politicians were corrupt and somehow got away with it despite the media allegedly looking at these things very carefully in a way that we would be shocked at today, the kind of just routine corruption in the U.S. Senate. So there are many ways in which the greater transparency and immediacy of information and diverse sources of information is a very good thing, actually. And I guess I tend to think that ultimately it helps more than hurts. I mean, the ability to get so many points of view, instantly online as opposed to the old days when there were 2 op-ed columnists maybe in whatever paper you could get in your state capital, and you really couldn't get national papers at that point, maybe one of them, So I mean, think of it, we would actually be shocked if we went back 30, 40 years. 3 TV shows, 22 minutes each, all put out within a mile of each other, 3 national TV news shows, and a couple of national papers, and that was kind of it. So I'm generally a defender of the current moment, but no question it has downsides too.
Well,
Yeah, I don't want to go back to the old days because it wasn't democratic, and we were the gatekeepers. So it means we held back a lot of information that white middle-aged guys didn't want you to hear. But I do worry about how more pernicious the new days could be. You mentioned Father Coughlin and Huey Long. What if the two of them, Father Coughlin, as you know, Royal Oak, Michigan, a segregationist, bigoted Catholic priest, what if they had Twitter? What if they had Facebook? How much more pernicious they could have been? And this is a problem that Bill and I, no institutions are going to be able to solve. This really is a cultural issue. This is a we the people issue. How do we now that we have these powers, how do we learn not to self-atomize each other and intellectually ghettoize each other? Why is it that in the beginning of this revolution, most of us choose never to come across an opinion that counters our bias? And we're sorting ourselves intellectually through these new communications. That's something that only a society over years and collectively can solve. I don't know how we're going to solve it.
How do you bust that media bubble for all of these different folks? Well, okay, so I want to jump into some questions that we got ahead of time. I didn't get names with them, so if you want to just stand up and shout out that was yours, feel free. Take some credit. And the first question, and this is a little bit about what we're talking about, but it says, in this, quote, post-truth era, how can we return to agreed upon facts and simply disagree about policy solutions or approaches? How do we get
I just
back
punted, so you answer it the right way.
No, I mean, I'm not sure there was ever, maybe there's a golden era for about 8 years where there was agreed upon facts, but I mean, I'm old enough to remember that I was in high school mostly, junior high in the 60s, and there weren't really agreed upon facts about Vietnam. Here's a good, read H.R. McMaster's book, current National Security Advisor, excellent book. I taught it one year at the Kennedy School when I was guest teaching a class, called Dereliction of Duty, which is about Johnson, McNamara, and the generals in Vietnam from about 65, 68. Just a fantastic case study in a public policy that went terribly wrong. The degree of deception, self-deception, controlling of evidence, failure to be candid with Congress and the American people. And that led to or partly led to a war in which we lost 55,000 Americans, 1 million Vietnamese were killed, and didn't have a good outcome at the end of it either, and did a lot of damage, you might say, also, I think, domestically in terms of side effects. So I guess I don't know. I mean, there's no easy answer, and look, Trump may be the kind of, may provoke a reaction that would be healthy in the sense of people saying, wait a second, we can't just let people get away with making assertions. We do have to fact check in a more serious way than when the New York Times corrects the spelling of the middle name of someone and is very proud of itself for having a very careful fact checking. I mean, the New Yorker is the famous one. I don't know what Ron's experience has been, but I just got a call. I think I'm quoted in some piece in the New Yorker this week. I guess I must be because I got a call from this very nice 24-year-old fact checker. I'm guessing 24-year-old, maybe 23-year-old at the New Yorker. I'm calling to fact check the piece. This, I'm sure you've had this experience. Well, of course, they don't call it to fact check. They call to read you your quotations that you told the reporter 3 days before on the phone and make sure that you said it, except, of course, I don't really remember exactly what I said. And I assume that, in this case, Evan Osnos took it down right, and it's more or less what I think, so it's not wildly wrong. I would rephrase it if I were being, an editor or something. But anyway, and so they read it back to you, and then you say, yeah, I think I said something like that to Evan. So, paste fact checked, I mean, there's something a little weird about the way the media thinks about these things. And in that respect, the disruptiveness of Twitter and the internet and people on the outside deciding to do their own kind of checking and attacking. I mean, look, the attacks on journalists, we've both been subject to many of them, I'm sure, are unpleasant and really are over the top sometimes and narrow-minded and even dangerous when you get a kind of mob attacking, how can this guy be an op-ed columnist? Outrage. On the other hand, I don't know, compared to the complacency of the old days and the intimate relationship that Jimmy Reston had with Jack Kennedy or that Stuart Alsop had with Richard Nixon, I can make the case that all in, this might be a healthier system.
I can tell you, I was at the New Yorker just this last week, and they were all 24-year-old fact checkers. So you're totally factually based on that. Ron, I get what Bill's saying, and there's a lot of truth behind that, and yet you've got terms quoted in the past 100 days like alternative facts. He was presenting alternative facts. That feels a little different, though, when you're hearing things like that, when you're hearing Sean Spicer come out and just say things that are inaccurate.
Yeah, I've only been doing this since Bill Clinton, who had, I became an expert at parsing what Bill Clinton would say. He wasn't always the most honest man, and the Bush administration would stretch the truth when it benefited them, so did Obama. I've never covered anybody at any level that was so loose with the truth as Donald Trump. That's not a partisan statement, it's just a fact. Yeah. They lie, and lie, at least I was raised at the AP, is when you knowingly mislead the people. They lie repeatedly, and they mislead people. Whether I can't always denote the motive, just more frequently than we've seen. It's beyond the norm and beyond the pale.
No, I very much agree with that, and it's worrisome that Trump has got away with it in the campaign. We'll see if he gets away with it as president, and I don't know what it says about the culture and about a certain, I mean, I spoke at Harvard a couple of months ago and couldn't resist, congratulating them, and they're the people who've problematized truth and understand that everything's just a narrative and everything's postmodern, and of course fact is such a boring, old-fashioned
and reductive. Everything is very reductive.
Yeah, and reductive, right? Old idea, and that they invented. Of course, everything's about identity, and congratulations, they invented. And I don't think this is entirely a joke either. The Academy sort of spent a lot of time. And avant-garde thinkers spent a lot of time problematizing the stupid old-fashioned notion of facts. And then guess what? It turned out that a right-wing, basically, or let's say a populist, nationalist authoritarian could use this just as well as a left-wing literature professor. And guess what? They invented or justified identity politics for minority groups and other groups, some of it legitimate in terms of groups that have been excluded. But it turned out that at some point the white working class looked up and said, hey, what, they get to vote identity politics, we get to vote identity politics. If they get to vote historical grievances, we get to vote historical grievances. Don't tell us these policies aren't necessarily best for us and they're not going to work. We're voting our identity, we're voting our grievances. So I think Trump is a weird and an unfortunate, I think, phenomenon, but it does have complicated cultural roots in a way.
And I don't know if he got away with it. His numbers have been tanking
Yeah.
since he came in office. And I wonder if he would have won if he ran against a candidate whose credibility rating was at 70% instead of 30%.
No, I think that's really a good point. And look, when you're president, presumably reality matters. I mean, I don't think you can spin around. At the end of the day, the jobs are coming back to Scranton, Pennsylvania, or Canton, Ohio, or they're not. At the end of the day, we're going to have a decent foreign policy and avoid war, and the U.S. alliances will be stronger. There won't be. And I kind of think campaigns are a little different in that way because it's a little more about promises and talk. And if your opponent isn't terribly credible either, you can get away with much more. I'm dubious that we're in such a post-fact environment that as president, you can sort of be in a post-reality environment. That really will be the question, though. I mean, obviously, there are people who've ruled in the past who've managed to rule. Historians look back and say, how did that person stay in office? I mean, this is mostly in non-democratic situations, but how did this person stay in office for 20 years when the whole country's being, going down the drain? And one hopes that in America there's enough responsiveness and enough focus on reality, and I think there is, that it would be hard to pull that off.
So I want to open it up to audience questions. So come on to the mic, but as folks come on down or decide to stand up, I do want to ask a very quick question because we are looking sort of forward after the 100 days. I want to look back for a second, though, because you brought it up, and I think it's sort of this question that everyone is, maybe not everyone, but a lot of folks are pondering, and that is, would Trump have lost if it wasn't Hillary Clinton in the Democratic nominee? And you've got this new book, Shattered Out, where you're reading just sort of the disastrous or what seemingly feels like stories of just kind of ultimate disaster among the campaign. Yes, that if it had been a different candidate?
Yeah, the morning of her news conference at the UN, when the email scandal had just been revealed by the New York Times, I wrote a column that said you have two choices. You can come out and deny it, blame the media, blame Republicans, hang on to the server, spin it, and your credibility will tank. And the best thing you got going for you is your credibility. Or you can come out and say, I put all my government email, your email, on a private server. I shouldn't have. The reason I did it is the Republicans were going to spend all their time mucking around on my email and not let me focus on my job. But you know what? I need to be better than Republicans. So I'm going to take my server, I'm going to give it back to the State Department Inspector General, who should have it in the first place. Of course, he's not going to release my personal emails. This isn't about my personal email anyhow. It's about my distrust of Republicans. If she'd done that, every reporter would have gone like this, even op-ed columnists. Republicans might have thrown a couple barbs at her, but it would have been impossible for the story to go further.
But that's not
Instead,
the Hillary Clinton way. We know from Whitewater, that's just she fundamentally can't give that to reporters, can she?
Well, there's a lot of scar tissue with Hillary Clinton. A lot of it is she's brought on herself. A lot of it has been unfairly foisted upon her. And it has created this cautiousness, this paranoia. She's actually, you've heard in private, and it's true, I knew her in private. She's a very charming, funny, engaging, much more engaging person to be around in private than Bill Clinton. But she never was able to let that out because she was always afraid. She's like a batter in baseball, choking up in the bat, grinding the bat, and therefore swinging tight. So that also led her to be very paranoid about being transparent. I can understand, I can empathize with it, but I can't condone it because she did put herself in a position. I literally had her senior aides, people I've known for years, saying trust doesn't matter. They were telling me this in the beginning of it. Trust doesn't matter because Bill. They would say her husband Bill got elected even though people didn't trust him.
And I would just add to that. I mean, go back a little further. When she left as Secretary of State, people have totally forgotten this. She had a high approval,
And she earned it.
favorable rating. Whether she was a good Secretary of State or not, whatever, people thought she worked hard. She was serious about it. They were reminded of her sort of impressive qualities. And then she did two things. The second and the most important was the failure to, having done the server, which was idiotic, the failure to just turn it over to the State Department and say, oh, fine, they'll sort out what's personal. I'm not going to unilaterally decide to erase 30,000 of the emails because I've decided they're personal. That's a little, and have this sketchy firm do it and so forth. But also remember, before that, what did she do for those 2 years between being Secretary of State and running for president? She gave speeches for $250,000 a year to Goldman Sachs and stuff, which was nuts. They had plenty of money. I don't personally care much, honestly, but I do not think without those speeches, if she had spent those 2 years being a very conventional, doing good deeds, serving on the boards of various not-for-profits, which she did anyway somewhat. But if she had made that the focus, I do not think the Sanders campaign takes off in the way it did.
I will say
and then I think, don't you think without the Sanders campaign being as strong as it was, she's then stronger in the, you know what I mean? I think the combination of these things was very damaging to her.
She had an uphill climb anyhow because of the populist movement and her being a status quo candidate from Washington. But she would have kicked Sanders' butt. I think just if it hadn't been for the email, even with the speeches.
Maybe.
Given the context of everything else, and she served in the White House, and she was successfully Secretary of State, if she was an honest, authentic, non-spinning candidate, instead you go back and look, her campaign lied and lied and lied. And I'm going to say again, lied, because they knew what they were saying about the email was wrong. Now, I'm not going to, there's a false equivalency between how often Trump lies and what he lies about and what Hillary did, but this election was hers to win.
And I'll just add,
And I will say, Democrats, if you really wanted to win that election last time, you should have been holding your candidate accountable, just as some Republicans have been holding Trump accountable.
and I would just say in a footnote, I mean, I always thought, I didn't think Trump would be the nominee. I thought he would go the way of, not to compare these people as individuals, but of Steve Forbes and Herman Cain and other businessmen who had fallen short on the Republican side, because the Republicans, for a long time, nominated establishment candidates, not the outsider, more populist, I mean, not that Forbes was, but or the Buchanan or the Perot, type. But having said that, I did go through 92 when I was Vice President Quayle's Chief of Staff. I think history will record that George H.W. Bush was really a pretty good president, and we won the Cold War, and we came out of a mild recession, and we signed some good bipartisan legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We had a pretty responsible budget deal that probably helped lay the groundwork for the growth of the 90s. And yet, for whatever reason, I learned this in 92, you try to make this case, people want to change. People want to change. They were sick of 12 years of Reagan-Bush. They wanted something new. Clinton, despite all the problems he had in the campaign, won pretty easily. Perot got 19% of the vote, 19 million votes. It really was a harbinger in that respect. Perot's a little bit crazy,
A little bit?
And he got 19 million votes. I used to say that and think, God, what does that say about America? Then Trump got 62 million American votes. But
Just
but I
stop
think-
saying it. I don't want to know
but
that.
But I would be on TV in September and October, and I'd say, look, I think Hillary's going to win. Everyone thought that, but I think it's still like 1 in 4 that Trump could win. I think Ron and I had sort of similar view on this, because in a change election, voters will forgive an awful lot about the change candidate, and they'll wish that he'll improve in office and be more responsible, and they'll convince themselves that, well, at least he'll change things, and I think it'll work out okay, and probably the institutions will constrain him if he's too bad. And so let's go for change at the end instead of the status quo. And I think the Clinton campaign wildly underrated that. I would say this off, in the green room conversations with them, I'd say, shouldn't you do more to be, what is she going to change? I mean, honestly, if you were a Clinton supporter, you couldn't answer the question, what is she going to actually change in Washington?
She could have been the change candidate.
And she could have been at least sort of the change candidate. I think enough to get over the hoop. And I remember them telling, well, the focus group showed that people don't believe she's changed, she's the status quo, so we're just going to disqualify Trump. Now, believe me, I believe there was a lot about Trump that was disqualifying, but it's just risky to run a presidential campaign totally on disqualifying the opponent. And I think Hillary Clinton ended up trying to do that.
I think it's the last time we'll see somebody make that mistake. That was a big lesson from this. Tactically, you can't just disqualify the other guy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of change, let's change a little bit. Why don't you go ahead and say what your name is and then
Dennis
your question, please.
Dennis Fleeman, is that coming through?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Dennis.
I have a question about the difference between Trump's public persona and his private persona.
Sure.
I was listening to an interview this morning, I think on WKR, and they were talking about, they were interviewing someone who was on the inside, says, in these private meetings, he's really quite adroit and asks really intelligent questions and really analyzes things, and he's really, really very sharp. And so I'm trying to see if maybe this public persona is sort of a shtick, that he does it for political reasons, but then he has a totally different view internally. I'd just be curious whether you've observed anything on that issue that you could enlighten us about.
I mean, I would say I've heard a little of that. It tends to be from people who work for him, so I discounted a little bit. I mean, I think he's just not an unintelligent man, and he's kind of a good, I think, reader of people sometimes. And I've heard of meetings where he asks people, he's smart, he goes around the room and asks them their opinions so they feel that he's listening, and sometimes he is listening. But I have also heard stories of his amazing impatience with listening to anything, his utter disinterest in policy or even in the institutions of public policy. I talked with a Republican governor who was in town for the routine things governors come to Washington for, some issues with the federal government, some regulatory stuff, whatever, it was all routine. They heard he was here, they invited him to see Trump, they talked, And he said he's been around, he was a governor, before that he was over senior official in the state. He said he's met with the last 3 or 4 presidents. And he said that the degree to which Donald Trump knows nothing about these major public policy issues or how policy is made, like how federalism works, how Congress works, is a little startling. Now, could others advise him? Can others pick up the slack? Can having good cabinet secretaries take help? Do you have to understand exactly why reconciliation bills have to be structured differently from normal, appropriations bills? No, of course not. We've had presidents who are more or less expert. Clinton was probably way on the right or left-hand side of the scale, whatever that would be in terms of policy knowledge. Reagan a little more, 20,000 feet. But I do think Trump, and what's depressing to me, I was a critic of Trump, so I'm not that surprised, but he doesn't seem to have spent much time thinking, gee, I better learn this now that I won. It's one thing to campaign and say, if I win, which I don't deep down think I will, I'll learn this stuff, but for now I can just get away with saying the wall and saying, various other, we're going to replace Obamacare with something much better, lower premiums, better health care, everything's going to be great. If you actually become president of the United States, and we're talking about the health care of tens of millions of Americans, you do owe it to the country to sort of learn a little bit about the alternative that you're supporting and what the different alternatives are to replace Obamacare, et cetera, et cetera. And I am depressed by the fact that he seems to feel no compunction to either learn anything much or, as Ron has been stressing, to be very careful or truthful about what he says about these things.
So Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, in my opinion, are exactly in private what you see in public. Hillary Clinton, I think, is much different. She's much more impressive in private than she is in public. One thing that strikes me about Trump, and I'll just pick up on this, Bill Clinton, I didn't start covering him as governor until he was about halfway through his term as governor, and I heard then a lot about how he had grown from when he got beat in '80. I watched him grow as a president. I saw how terrible his first 100 days were. And he brings in Leon Panetta and basically tells Leon, teach me how to lead. Not just teach me how to, Washington, but how can I be a better leader? How can I stop this carousel of people in my office? And, whatever you think about Bill Clinton politically, he grew as a president, and he was insatiably curious. You could spend 10 minutes with Bill Clinton today, and he'll wear your butt out because he's sucking information out of you. Again, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that's an impressive thing in a leader, in a person. Donald Trump, I cannot think of a more insecure man I've ever met. I've known him not as a person, not as closely as I knew the Clintons, but I've covered Trump since the late 90s. The most insecure man I've ever met. I've known a lot of insecure men in politics. He is way up there in craving attention, affirmation. It's really, Clinton was a pretty hungry guy when it came to attention and wasn't the most secure person. Donald Trump is another form altogether.
I would just say on that, Clinton, I wasn't a big Clinton fan, but I was a Republican and voted against him twice. But Clinton and the other presidents we've had, and I think this is uniformly true of them, Obama, Bush, Clinton, just going back. They knew they were president of the United States, and ultimately reality is what mattered. And God knows they were political, and they would adjust things and not pursue certain agenda items if they thought they were unpopular, and make some deals that we'd look back on slightly like, ooh, really? You had to say that at that time because you thought it was popular and so forth. And I think they themselves have a little bit of that regret, probably. Still, at the end of the day, someone like Clinton was willing to say, we're going to go with a 93 budget, and it's going to it's going to be a couple of rough years, but we're going to get the economy going, the deficit's going to come down, and eventually it'll pan out, probably in time for my reelection, which would be good, Clinton thought, but really good for the country. And Reagan, when you think about what he did in '81, '82, sticking with Volcker through a really rough recession. When you think of George H.W. Bush and some of the foreign policy stuff where he laid the groundwork for things and got criticized, including by me privately at times, but things that paid off 6, 12, 18 months later. And I would say President Obama, don't agree with him much, but again, and George W. Bush, the same in both cases.
Definitely.
I really have no confidence that Trump does much. For Trump, I think it is a weekly reality show, and it's whatever's in the headline. I'm going to make news this week. I'm going to say something interesting. I'm going to divert attention if something's going badly. I don't have much confidence that there's much of a thought there about what policies can I lay the groundwork for that will pay off domestically or internationally in a year or 2 or 3. I think the people around him think that way, McMaster and Mattis. I think some of the domestic policy people, Price at HHS is a serious congressman, as maybe some of the other cabinet secretaries, but and we just have not, so the experiment of having a president who doesn't, at least to some degree, think seriously about governing as opposed to performing, I think that's really the situation we're in.
And if he does care about more than this news cycle and his latest rating and the size of his crowds, he's got to start showing people that. That's not something he should keep to himself.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of the first 100 days just as this block of time that we all have made a very big deal of. We are here tonight to talk about this.
Donald Trump made a big
Yeah,
deal.
he
of it.
Well,
did.
and
I
that's,
have all his promises right here.
yeah, okay.
2 pages.
Oh, is that from PolitiFact? With the
No,
notes
this is
on it?
Donald
Okay.
Trump's contract. This
Yeah,
is what,
right.
for America or on America? With
Yeah,
America,
Yeah,
that he promised he would get done in his first 100 days.
so good.
Put this out during the campaign.
So good, and then they put all the, well, so this is a question from the audience. As was mentioned in the introductory remarks that President Clinton's first 100 days were marked by major setbacks, it seems this fairly arbitrary marker of an entire presidency. So what features do you believe will continue for the next 4 or 8 years?
Well, he is who he is. He's 70 years old, so I think it maybe was unreasonable to expect him to change much. I personally thought, people are resistant to change. I'm sure I am, but still, the White House is the White House, and the Oval Office is the Oval Office, and that really is different from everything else one has done, and that might change him. I'm sort of honestly depressed and worried that it seems not to have changed him much. I do think the most important thing to happen, and I mentioned this already in the first 100 days, was the replacement of Michael Flynn by H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor. Flynn got a lot of attention when Flynn left, because of Russia and all that, but people didn't really focus as much as they might have on, and that is such an important job. And McMaster, in my view, is such an impressive guy. Now, he hasn't really been he's been a military officer. He hasn't really thought much until, he's thought about it because he wrote that book, but he hasn't had much experience in managing the White House and the interagency process. But I feel a lot better about the next three years and 9 months, if that ends up being Trump's tenure in office, with McMaster there, along with Mattis, Tillerson, to Pompeo, and others. I do feel that we're more likely not to go wildly off the rails in foreign policy. I think that's the most important thing that happened in the first 100 days. Honestly.
I'm a little less sanguine because I'm assessed on trust in the truth. And if you can't be trusted, you can't lead. And if you can't be trusted, there's going to come a point in time when the American public, not just the world, the globe, is going to have to trust what the American president says. And he has not yet shown a propensity to be able to tell the truth consistently.
When does that happen, though? When do the supporters finally go, I mean, this is the question that I sort of
Well,
wrestle
some of them
with.
have. I think people are overdoing how.
I mean, is this the 40%,
he's
approval
gone
rate
from
right
46
now?
to 40, and maybe he'll go to 36 in 3 more months. And you can be pretty low. I mean, people don't like saying they were wrong.
Yeah.
This is why, and people are partisan. So this is why Bush and Obama, even at their lowest points, hung on to an awful lot of their supporters.
Richard Nixon hung on a lot of people.
Yes,
once he got off
people
office.
forget the day he left office. I think he had a 28% approval or something. So I think there's I think reality does
part
matter
of this
there.
is change things. Either they really, really want change, and there's still not another alternative.
Right.
So some people are going to hang on with Donald Trump until he either collapses or he somehow soars.
Don't you worry? I'm a worry, man. Let's be less judgmental. Do you think it's possible that if Trump fails, I'm not saying blows up or spectacularly fails, just sort of doesn't really succeed in passing a lot of his legislation, and doesn't succeed in turning around the manufacturing and so forth? What people like me would hope, well, maybe the Republican primary voters will come to their senses and we'll have a different candidate in 2020 or a different party, or could it be the opposite? That Trump wasn't radical enough. Trump turned out was captured by the establishment, and the Democrats, of course, are bitter about Hillary losing. And I do think if you think Sanders, Trump, which for me is the case, is an unattractive, let's say, way in which the parties are developing, 45% of each in 2016, well, you could have sort of Sanders, Trump on steroids in 2020. Do you think that's possible?
If I had to predict, that's what I would predict, that the peasants with their pitchforks are sharpening those things. And until they get affirmative change that makes this country better, where they feel connected to their politics, they don't just have 2 choices that are just arguing over which party sucks the least, and aren't just worried about the election, until they feel like their politics matters again, they're going to get madder and madder, and more of them will get madder and madder. And now they're starting to realize how much power they have. Look what they did. They almost got Bernie Sanders elected to the Democratic Party, and they elected Donald Trump. So now they're pissed and powerful. We could look back at this last
That's
election.
a good title for a book. I'm just saying, if you want to sell it.
Yeah, you
You
agree.
just copyrighted a.
Pissed and Powerful, American Politics, 2017,
2016 may be the good old days when we look
Yeah.
back 4-8 years from now,
Well, and
unless our parties get their act together.
And I want to look forward to that, but I also see that Charlie Ballard is standing here with a question. Really, we should be asking you the question, the person who knows more about Michigan, the economy here in the state than anyone else in this room is about to to ask a question, but
My
go ahead,
question isn't
Professor.
about the economy exactly, it's about race. Before Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and then Lyndon Johnson signed it, my assessment, and I'm a native Texan, and I grew up in a place where there were no Republicans, white Americans who were motivated by racial animosity and racial resentment tended to be Democrats, because after all, that was the party of slavery. Now, white Americans who are motivated by racial animosity and resentment tend to be Republicans. But, you know, Mitt Romney didn't run a racist campaign. But my assertion, which I'd like to know whether you agree with it, Trump's 2016 campaign was the most overtly racist campaign since George Wallace in 1968. And that has opened a Pandora's box. We've seen huge increases in all sorts of racist, anti-Semitic, et cetera, threats and bullying and graffiti and all sorts of stuff like that. Will that genie, what is the prospects that that genie will be put back in the bottle? Or are we going to be stuck with it?
When was that genie in the bottle? When's the last time in American history we didn't have people who were motivated by racial intolerance?
No, I didn't say that we never have. I just said that it seems like there's been a big upsurge. And will that ever turn around, or will it continue or accelerate? That's my question.
There was a huge uptick in that deplorable, inexcusable, vile thinking and action after President Obama was elected. It wasn't President Obama's fault, but there sure was an uptick in it, and it's documented. Look, there is a segment of society that is bigoted and hateful. I'd like to think it's still a pretty relatively small section of society that is bigoted and hateful. People voted for Trump for a lot of reasons. I think most people who voted for Trump aren't bigots and racists. They're angry. They've been lied to by the Republican Party. They've been abandoned and lied to by the Democratic Party. The global economy's taken away their jobs. Their kids are doing worse than they did. They're doing worse than their grandparents did. They desperately want change so bad. Some of these folks who are labeled as racist that they voted for Barack Obama last cycle and now are voted for Donald Trump this time. So I don't excuse that kind of behavior, but I think it's always been there. I think I think the silver lining is this generation that's coming up, this millennial generation that is majority minority, and that is much more tolerant than Gen Xers or baby boomers, and are just, like I said, statistically are going to be less biased because whites will be a minority here in a few short, remarkable years. I think if Democrats want to figure out how to defeat people like Trump, they should start looking at their party and ask themselves how it is they got beat like a guy like Donald Trump. It isn't because of a lot of, the country has so many bigots that Donald Trump was able to galvanize them. It was because the country desperately, generally speaking, it's because the country desperately wants change and the Democrats haven't offered it. And haven't offered it since 2008 and then didn't deliver it. And the Republicans offered change that was scary to a lot of people, but they weighed their fear of change and their distaste for Donald Trump, for a lot of them, against their fear of the status quo. As Bill was saying earlier, they want to change so badly, they're willing to take a risk and even excuse some of the stuff. Maybe it won't be so bad when he gets in office. So yes, I hate that there's people in this country who might vote based on racial animus. But what I fear even more than that is what we're talking about earlier, that if we don't get our acts together, these people across the spectrum, from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump and in the middle, the silent middle, who are so desperate for change that they took a chance on Barack Obama and voted for Donald Trump, they're just going to get angrier. And it won't just be angry against people who don't look like them. It'll be angry against the institutions that make us a society, that prevent us from being an anarchy. That's what really scares me.
Yeah, please come forward.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm noticing a lot of negativity towards Trump. I'm just wondering, what good do you think Trump has done in the first 100 days?
Well, Yeah, you are noticing a lot of negativity, but and I mean, I just
Good
don't have a
question.
high opinion of him, so I'm slightly negative here. But and Ron too, I think. But no, I'm a constitutional conservative, so I like the nomination of now Justice Gorsuch, and I think there he could have picked his sister's friend there, who's probably pretty competent too, but he pretty much went with a conventional consensus establishment view of the conservative legal community, which was that Neil Gorsuch was one of the most distinguished conservative appellate court judges, and I think he'll do a good job on the bench. So I'm pleased by that. I think one effect he could have that will be good is, and Ron sort of alluded to this in a couple of ways, is things have gotten a little stale, maybe more than a little stale, but let's say just a little stale. I mean, you had 3 8-year presidencies of Clinton, Bush, and Obama. It looked for a while that we were going to have a Clinton versus Bush race. I think that helped Trump hugely, incidentally. I mean, he was very lucky, very clever in the way he exploited it. But really, if you had to be the outsider candidate, the radical time for a change, populist, demagogue type candidate, what would you want? You'd want the brother and son of the former president in the primary as your sort of, looked like front runner at the beginning, and the guy with $100 million. And then you'd want the wife of the former president, 2 families that have been dominant, really, in American politics for, a quarter century in which, as Ron has said, people think things, at least some chunk of people, think things are going on the wrong direction. So if things are going in the wrong direction, let's nominate the 2 families that have been charged for the last 25 years. Trump was helped hugely by that. In a way, his election has maybe broken up things. It could be in a dangerous way. People can be people can be legitimately angry and make very stupid choices. That is the bad news. I mean, saying the anger is legitimate doesn't mean that what the solution they're going to select or the people they're going to vote for are going to make things better. They can make things even worse. So part of responsible leadership is saying the anger is legitimate, but let's not exaggerate it. America in 2017 is not the worst place to live in the world's history. It's not the worst place to live in the current world. It's probably even a better place to live than America 30 years ago in many, many, many ways, despite wage stagnation and so forth. So I think part of responsible leadership is telling people the truth about the current situation, and there's been too much, in my view, sort of, encouraging of a sort of certain narrative that I don't think is quite right. But in any case, whether or not that is true, Trump may end up having sort of broken up the establishment enough that fresh thinking could come to the fore. I mean, one could imagine the sort of nightmare scenario, if you will, of 2020, which is, oh my God, it's sort of Sanders and Trump on steroids. Or you could imagine that 2020 is when we got beyond, finally the baby boomers go away. I thought I wrote an editorial in 2015 that annoyed some of my fellow baby boomers. I got attacked by one of them in the Washington Post. I said, you know what? 24 years of baby boomer presidents is enough. And they were not bad men, but they had limitations, and some of them had to do with, I just did some pop psychology about baby boomers and stuff. And finally this year, we're likely to get, at least on the Republican side, and I was really writing about the Republicans, a Rubio or a Cruz or a Walker or someone, a new generation Republican, and that will be healthy. And finally, much as I admire Romney and McCain, we'll get beyond the sort of 70-year-old nominees. And then, of course, we ended up with a 70-year-old nominee. We had ended up, Clinton, think of this, at a time of amazing change and a large rising generation and the need for fresh thinking, we ended up with the 2 nominees, if you sort of add their ages together, the oldest pair of nominees in American history. I mean, there have been individual nominees, Dole and Reagan, who were a little bit older, but never both parties have nominated a 70-year-old and a 68-year-old, I guess it is. So that's kind of weird, and that was like the final gasp. The baby boomers just will never go away. They sort of wouldn't finally give up either party. They go desperately hanging on to power. One last gasp with Hillary and Trump. Maybe finally, we'll get past the baby boomers and get some fresh thinking. And Trump, in a weird way, could inadvertently...
You don't think Joe Biden's going to run in 2020?
Look, he probably will. That will be... I'll be confidently sitting here, and then someone will tape this in 2020. They'll play this back, and we're having the Biden-Trump race.
Let me build on that and try to answer your question more directly instead of preaching at you, and I apologize if you felt preached at. I think we can put and let me connect the 2 thoughts. We can put the genie back in the bottle. We can put this vile racism and us versus themism in the bottle if we deliver an affirmational, disruptive candidate to the American people. Not just a candidate, an affirmationally disruptive president. Somebody who doesn't just change the way we campaign, but changes the way we govern. Somebody who brings us together to reform our political institutions, redistricting, get rid of term limits, money in politics. Somebody like Barack Obama, again, this isn't a political partisan statement. Barack Obama was affirmational, yes we can, and disruptive as a candidate. he didn't bring that change to governance. You can make all kinds of reasons and excuses, but he didn't. Somebody like that who brings affirmational change to politics would curb that anger and that frustration and the feeling that we have to be pitted against each other. Know that, yes, we can come together and change things. And to answer your question, it's kind of related. Trump may have shown us that we can do that. If we can come together and do something so dramatic as electing a guy like Donald Trump, if there's so many of us who want this kind of change that we almost nominated, we meaning Democratic voters, not necessarily me, but we almost had nominated a major party, Bernie Sanders, then we can find somebody else out there who in a positive way would change things. And when I'm asked who is the next TR, who's the next great president, I always say in speeches, I don't know what her name is, but she's a 31-year-old Latina making a shitload of money, doing a lot of good. She's somewhere in that social entrepreneurship space right now, who's seen a problem that government and business isn't solving. She's radically connected with a bunch of other people who believe in the same thing. And whether it's an app for feeding people or a literacy program in Detroit, and I picked Latina because of the rising generation, a woman because she can't be somebody who looks like me, and she's about 31 years old now, who's about to be on the cusp of being presidential age, and will have already led in a new way. She's created something from nothing, and has led in a new way in creating the social entrepreneurship, whatever it is. And I think that's the kind of person, that's a kind of cat. In a way, Obama was kind of that, although it was offline with community activism. That's the kind of cat who's going to be the next great president.
Any
My version-
31-year-olds in the audience who want to?
And she'll be part of a generation that is majority-minority.
I mean, my version of that is it will be a 9/11 veteran, someone who volunteered after 9/11, served in the military, had that unique experience, a really amazing experience that the military gave these young men and women of leading people in very tough circumstances and doing an amazing job. Maybe it's be the same. Maybe this person.
Same kind of
maybe this
person.
person will be a veteran, so that
Part
way
of the
we
next
could,
greatest
we
generation.
could both be
Or
right.
this is going to be an amazing race.
If anyone knows a 31-year-old Latina, not post 9/11 veteran who would like to run for president when she's 35, let Ron or me know.
The common thing we're talking about, though, it's a purpose-driven millennial. It's a really remarkable generation.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is George. People have a model in their minds of how.
George, will you come just a little closer to the
I'm
microphone?
afraid of this thing.
I get you, sir. I get you.
I'm with you.
Yeah, people have a model. Each person has a model of how the world works. Donald Trump has a model of how the world works. He's a practical kind of a person. He's certainly not an academic wonk.
Did I laugh out loud? I'm sorry.
When you think about how he's built his business, he's had to deal with all kinds of people. New York City government, all these regulations, all this garbage you have to deal with to build a building, and he's built a successful business. I'm just wondering about, you look at the kind of people he's brought into his cabinet, the fellow from Commerce, it's a very knowledgeable, practical kind of a guy. He's looking for practical solutions. I'm just wondering where you think his model that he's developed over time based on his experiences is going to take the country over the next 4 years. Earlier, you folks made a comment about, well, he's not a politician. He hasn't served an elective office. Where have these people taken us over the last 20, 50 years? We got $20 trillion in debt. We have an annual national deficit. The dollar has gone down in value tremendously since the Federal Reserve got established. We got all kinds of trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. We got threats in Iran. We got threats from the North Koreans. What the hell good are these politicians? Donald Trump's not a politician.
Yeah, so let me defend
and
the
he has a model in his mind.
I'm not sure what model he has in his mind. I would say business models sometimes work in government and sometimes don't. But I just want to say a word about the politicians because believe me, with Weekly Standard has been hostile to the status quo and for reform, certainly for dealing with the debt. Something I might add that Paul Ryan, a career politician, the kind of person who allegedly isn't serious about any of this, brought an entire political party, the Republican Party, onto what I would regard as a responsible position on entitlements, which is the cause of the debt. Bill Clinton tried to do that for the Democrats, and it was a little tenuous, and then Obama flirted with it and backed away. Who's the person who's not dealing with that at all? Donald Trump. Donald Trump is utterly unserious about the debt. He won't touch any of the entitlements. And I'll make a broader point. Have these politicians done so badly? Is America in 2017, in the last 70 years, been horrible for the world and horrible for America compared to the preceding 50 years or the 50 years before that or the 50 years before that. No major wars in the last, things that were perfect since the end of the Cold War. We did win the Cold War in a pretty impressive way. We then have maintained world peace mostly since 1991, I think in a pretty impressive way. It's some sacrifice with some mistakes, obviously. The economy, people are better off than they ever have been. Healthcare, we spend too much money, but a lot of people's lives are being saved today in ways they wouldn't have been 30, 40 years. I really disagree with the notion that the saga of the last 20 years or the last 50 years has been one of failure. Go to India and China and tell a billion people who've come out of poverty that, well, those last 50, 40 years with American troops deployed all over the place like Donald Trump doesn't like, with the Koreans not playing their share, the Chinese taking advantage of Russian trade deals. That's just been ridiculous. That's been terrible for us and terrible for the world.
I think a lot of your assessment is at variance with a lot of the people that voted for Donald Trump.
It is, and I think the people who voted for Donald Trump are wrong, and I think I do, and I think that's why I didn't support him, and I think they take for granted all that progress. They think we just take for, it's fine, of course we have 1 billion Chinese and Indians who are not on starvations, on the edge of starvation. Of course the nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945. Of course, for all the problems of radical Islam and of Putin and stuff, we've managed to basically preserve a pretty decent, pretty stable liberal world order. We can just pocket that, take that for granted, and now we can take a fun gamble on Donald Trump. I hope we can survive this gamble, but I think it's a much more tenuous thing than people realize. A lot of presidents, this is sort of Ron's point about the importance of the individual, a lot of presidents have put a lot of time into, done a lot of unpopular things, honestly, to preserve this world order. And I don't see Trump understanding how important that is. And I'm worried that it can unravel. And I think when it unravels, it can unravel very fast. History suggests that it's a little more tenuous than we think. So I'm sort of a defender of the last 70 years if it comes to that.
And I'm not.
I want to get to you.
Right, so Ron differs from me on this, yeah.
And we only have a few minutes left. I want to get to you, though, and then one final question.
Yeah,
for me.
go ahead,
I would not defend the current political system. I think there's a lot of good men and women in it, but the system itself is obviously corrupt and pay to play. It's disconnected from the people. It's only, both parties are only interested in winning elections. They don't look long-term. It's all short-term decisions, not long-term decisions. The political system is getting exactly what it deserves, which is extreme disruption. Now, Donald Trump's model. If you look at his model, the way he's conducted himself as an adult and as a business person, it's a model that I'm not sure is the right one for the presidency. He's been very self-focused his entire career. Trump on all the buildings, this is all about me. He's been very deceptive his whole career. His record of lying in office didn't just start when he got in office. He's someone who has a long, again, I don't have a personal problem with him, I don't even have a political problem with him, but he's been a serial deceiver his entire public life. The way he's, let me just finish, if his model for treating other people, especially women, his whole public life is not the kind of model that I think is fitting for a presidency. We've heard what he has said himself in his own words about the way he treats women. We've seen the way he's treated people who have worked for him. These are facts, not my opinion. So and we've seen how he's run his business. The man has had 4 bankruptcies. That's not, I know what his talking point is, oh, I played the rules the way I played them. No. 4 times he did not have money to pay hardworking vendors who he had promised he would pay them. That's not a man who keeps his word. So that's his model for leadership and his model as a man. I can understand why people voted for him. I won't defend this current political system. And I know a lot of people, and I live around a lot of people who voted for him. I really get it. But as someone who voted for him, it's really healthy and important for you to understand what the model that he really has led by, and that is the model.
We could do this all night, so I appreciate your questions. I think one of the final questions that I want to get to, though, is as we sort of start looking forward and wrapping things up, and this came up a little bit, and that is just this idea of, can we put the genie back in the box in this idea of sort of decorum and civilized debate? I mean, I was in Detroit. I don't know if you were, Ron, at the Republican debate in Detroit over the fall, and that was when we got the size of the hands debate and little Marco. I mean, have we kind of just opened this box that now we are the apprentice in American politics, or do we go back to something different?
I don't know, again, this is not something that started with Trump. I've watched the political discourse in Washington become more and more abrasive just in the 20 years I've been involved. The last election, Donald Trump have obviously taken it to a whole nother level. I hope Bill is right, and he might be that one of the lessons we get from this is even if I voted for him or not, even if I think he's a good president or not, is this really how I want the president to behave? Is this how we want our kids to behave? Is there a lesson that we, the people, can take from that? I hope that we do, that is one lesson we take from this, that no matter what you think about Donald Trump as a person and a president, this is not how we're supposed to be behaving. And it's not good enough that Democrats have been bad too. We all need to behave better than we have been.
I agree with that. I was just coming back to defending the political system for 1 second. I mean, we have had...
Good luck with that.
We have had in the last 50 years a massive civil rights revolution, which was a just revolution, a massive, let's call it feminist revolution, but let's say achievement of legal equality, certainly, for women, something fairly unprecedented in world history almost, certainly in American history, and a massive revolution in terms of sexual orientation. And you know what? The political system, in its halting, complicated, confusing way, has managed to assimilate, I would say, all those changes in a pretty decent way. It is a more decent society today than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And people can be unhappy about all kinds of things, but I really think it's just, one shouldn't forget that. Now, one of the things that most upsets me about Trump, therefore, is the kind of routine denigration of opponents, to some degree of other groups. And that is something we haven't seen from either party in a long, long time, really. When everyone thinks of President Obama and President Bush and Dole and Clinton, I mean, they did not go there. And I think we benefited a lot from them not going there. It's one of those things you take it for granted. Well, that's how our politicians are. They're kind of staid, they're kind of boring, they're kind of polite to each other on the debate stage. They don't personally attack people and denigrate them. They try pretty hard not to attack ethnic groups or say disparaging things about racial groups and stuff, and we take that for granted. And maybe we're a little too staid, and maybe we don't appreciate the transgressive fun of having someone out there saying things that are, quote, politically incorrect, and I'm a big critic of political correctness, but again, we take for granted a certain decorum and decency among our politicians, a lot of it insincere and hypocritical, but nonetheless, a certain decorum and decency. And it shouldn't be taken too much for granted. We know what political systems that don't have that can degenerate into, and that is one of the things that most alarmed me about Trump as a candidate, and to some degree as a president, though he is checked here much more, I think, by the institutions.
So final few seconds, about 30 seconds. In 100 days, it'll be something like August 7th. What do you hope we're talking about in the next 100 days, Ron?
The Tigers' 100-game winning streak.
Fair enough. I'll take that. Bill?
I could give a Nats answer, a Bryce Harper answer, and
What do I hope we're talking about?
I hope we're not talking about some war we've stumbled into by sort of mistake or by foolish signaling to either allies or to, more importantly, to opponents. And I hope we aren't talking about a trade war around the world, honestly. And I hope we're talking about domestic policies that, and that's complicated, we can differ on healthcare, taxes, and all that, but that basically are improving our growth rate, but again, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I hope we're talking about a system that retains the rule of law, respect for the Constitution, an understanding of limited government, an understanding of the limits of executive power, and is not looking more third world than we look right now.
I hope we're talking about a president who showed amazing growth and surprised all of us by reaching beyond his base and galvanizing the public around some affirmational and even outside-the-box ideas. And I hope we're talking about the president's 70% approval rating. I want my president to succeed, no matter what party he's in. He's only going to do that if he changes his ways. And I hope we're talking about how wrong we all were about him. Even his supporters really don't expect him to change in a great way. I hope we all realize, holy moly, we were wrong. This guy really figured it out. And now 70% of us are behind him. And he's changing politics for the better.
August 7th.
That's what I hope.
Well, I'll text you and see how that's going on August.
Well, I also hope for the Tigers to have a 100-game winning streak.
Okay. Ron
I'm a
Fournier.
dreamer.
Bill Kristol, thank you for your insights this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. And especially thank you to Thank you to Michigan State University for holding events like this, particularly now more than ever, having dialogues like this. So thank you to Cindy Kyle and Matt Grossman for putting this together. This is so important, I think, right now when we're talking about decorum and democracy. So thank you for having us. Oh,
moderating.
sure thing. Oh, sure. Okay, thank you, everyone.